What's up, everyone? We are going live right now, and I'm so excited because I am asking Lisa to join us. It's almost going to be like, this is going to be like a mini podcast episode. Lisa Mitro is joining us, and we are going to
Hey,
talk about glutes. Hey, Lisa, how are you? How's it going,
good.
Lisa?
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me?
Is my connection okay?
I
Yes, I
sure
can hear
can. Well,
you. Can
thanks
you
for
hear
doing
me?
this. I'm so excited to talk about
Yeah.
glutes with you. That's a little weird, but this is also the first time that we've ever interacted and hung out together a little bit, and so a little weird to be doing it live, talking about glutes. But hey,
That's okay. That's okay. I'm very excited to be on here and be talking to you because glutes are very important for runners. So I feel like it's just like talking about the toes. It's
weird but
weird, but it's
important.
important.
That's like my favorite type of thing to talk about. Um, So let's get into this. And what I also think I want to do with you is I would love to do a longer form conversation on the Strength Running podcast. So definitely keep that in mind. We're not going to cover everything about this topic here, but when we talk about the importance of glute strength, the importance of glute activation, and all these different ways of thinking about this very important muscle complex for runners, I'd love to get your initial thoughts right from the start on this idea of whether or not our glutes need to be activated. Like we never hear about this for the quads, right? Like, why are we not activating our quads, but we have to activate our glutes? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start because and I feel like glutes just get all the hype because most runners have trouble activating them versus our quads. Most runners are able to activate their quads. We strengthen our quads all the time. We don't necessarily always strengthen that posterior chain in the gym, especially if you're a newer runner. So I feel like the glutes just get so much hype because they're not always activated to their max potential. They're not always activated as much as they should be. We've all heard the term lazy glutes or they're inhibited, which is not normally the case, especially with them being inhibited unless you've had, a stroke, traumatic brain injury, something like that. If you can squeeze your glutes, they can contract. They can work for you. Most likely, they're just weak. They're just not working like they should. They need to be strengthened and you need to learn certain movement patterns so they can work for you as a runner. So I feel like that's just why they get all the hype because they're just not working like they should most of the time with a lot of runners, especially
It
injured
almost
runners.
seems like we've created this whole new vocabulary to talk about the glutes where it almost maybe is more accurate just to say your glutes are just a little bit too weak. They need to be activated,
Mm-hmm.
quotes here, with strength training. And
Mm-hmm.
this whole thing
Mm-hmm.
about lazy glutes or sleepy glutes, I love that one. Like your glutes are sleeping behind you somewhere.
Yeah.
Uh, so is that really the key here that runners have to understand is that number one, let's strengthen our glutes. And number two, let's engage them in a variety of movement patterns, like we do with most other muscles, when we engage in things like drills and dynamic flexibility exercises, all those things that improve how we move. Is that something that we also have to do with the glutes?
Yeah, I think so. And in terms of like the movement pattern with the glutes, it really starts with being able to activate them. And that comes down to more of like that neuromuscular level. So, do you have that motor control where you can tell your brain to turn your glutes on? Like, can you squeeze your glutes in the seated position? Can you do this rep after rep? Or does it get difficult towards, say, 30 reps? And then once you have that motor control, you can activate your glutes. That's when you can start learning different movement patterns and you can start strengthening your glutes. So one big mistake that I see is a lot of runners will say, well, I strengthen my glutes. I do squats and lunges. But if you don't have that foundational activation it's going to be really hard to build strength with your glutes, and especially after strength, building that power so you can build speed. So I feel like when runners start with glute activation, it really needs to come down to that
I'm pretty
foundational
sure
level.
everyone listening to this just tried to squeeze their glute muscles while they were sitting down.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. That was another thing, actually. Speaking of, I've heard my glutes, what is it? My glutes don't get activated because I sit all the time, and it's like, well, you're sitting on your hamstrings too, and they can still be activated. That's not necessarily going to take away from them not activating as much versus having that foundation, having that strength, and hip mobility as
Yeah,
well
this
plays
is
a
really
big role.
interesting because it almost seems like it's a combination of coordination and strength that runners have to work on. Probably not,
Mm-hmm.
a wild thing to understand if anybody has listened to me or you over the years. Um, let's think about some of the ways that we can work on our glute strength, our glute coordination. And I'd love to talk to you about this from like what we can do pre-run, if there's anything we can do during a run, what to do post-run, and then the other 23 hours of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you advise maybe not sitting down for as long, of extended stretches, or if there's
Mm-hmm.
anything else we should think about so that we're just not putting ourselves at a disadvantage with our lifestyle, so that when we do go to
Mm-hmm.
train, we're just in the best possible position to get as much out of that as possible. So can we start with like pre-run? Do you like runners to do some sort of warm up? Does it focus on the glutes? Like what should we do then?
Yeah, that's a good question. This seems to be a pretty big theme with social media right now. And I actually, all the pre-run activation for glutes, I actually have never given one of my one-on-one clients, an injured runner, any sort of glute activation exercises pre-run, because I find that yes, your glutes need to be activated when you run, and maybe you have more difficulty activating them, but what about your quads and your soleus and your hamstring? I mean, at that point, you could just be strength training before you run, with everything that needs to be activated. And it's more of that co-contraction and the timing, like you said. So in terms of pre-run, I think a dynamic warm-up and drills is plenty, as long as you're strength training and you're working on that glute activation, the glute strength outside of running as well. Okay, so that's where I kind of like to start, is like that dynamic warm up. And then also, if the one thing I will say is during a run, that's when I will give out some glute activation exercises, because maybe your glutes can activate, say, mile one in a run, or maybe a mile and a half in, and then maybe they start to get fatigued, or you start to lose that hip extension when you're running. So you just need that reinforcement. And that's when I find the glute activation exercises are very helpful throughout the run. Like, say, every 10 minutes, every mile, or every so often throughout your run. And that's way easier to do if you're running on a treadmill. So you can just jump off, do, 30, 50 reps of a certain glute activation exercise, and then jump back on, just to reinforce that
Let
movement
me ask
pattern.
you a question. Like, why is it that we have to stop our run to do some glute activation exercises? Again, it's like we're spending so much time focusing on the glutes here, and I know that they are so important for our power moving forward. It's one of the largest muscle groups in the human body. Uh, what's going on physiologically that is forcing us to keep those muscles engaged throughout the run? Is it just a weakness, like we don't know how to use them and they just kind of turn off? What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it comes down to the movement patterns that we learn outside of running, and also just how we can fatigue quickly. Like, if you're just starting to strengthen your glutes, they might not be strong enough for a 10-mile run. Throughout that entire 10-mile run, your form might change, your trunk posture might start to hinge forward. Maybe you're not getting into that full hip extension from your hip joint, and therefore those glutes can't activate 100%. So that's a great question. I think, if we can reinforce certain movement patterns, and that's not a forever thing. You're not doing this every
Thanks,
run,
Lisa.
all the time. It's just maybe, yeah, yeah, we don't have to stop throughout every run. But it will help for certain cases just to reinforce that hip extension with the glute and hamstring co-contraction. And that's where I really find it's most helpful. I definitely don't give this out to every runner.
Yeah.
It just kind of
And
depends on the case.
this is really underlining the really important point that it's not actually a good idea to go out for a 10-mile run, a 15-mile run, a 20-mile run when you're not really conditioned for that type of experience. And I think a lot of runners just think, they're a heart and lungs with little stick legs and they don't have to worry about your muscles because we're only focused on our endurance all the time. So this is probably like a great advertisement for just strength training for runners right now. Let's talk about the post-run time frame. Like you mentioned, you probably don't have to do an overabundance of glute work in the warm-up because you're hopefully doing some good strength training outside of your running. What does some of that training look like? Is it sort of classic squats and deadlifts and things like that, or are we doing some more specific glute focused exercises?
Yeah, I mean, if we're not able to activate our glutes correctly or they're weaker, then they need to be targeted more towards adjusting and fixing that movement pattern. So I always like to start with that neuromuscular re-ed where we're just focusing on activating the glute. And once you have that down, that's when you can move into more of a dynamic motion. So maybe we're now working on the hip hinge. So like you said, like the deadlift, single leg deadlift, where we're really focusing on hips, back, and lengthening the glute while strengthening it. But you also want to consider the concentric glute strengthening, box step ups, that sort of thing, where you can really focus on using your glutes and, almost like feeling your glutes being used as well. You don't necessarily have to always squeeze your glutes for them to be activated. I think that's a common myth. I've heard even runners say that they've tried squeezing their glutes when running, and that's just, your glutes should be activating naturally, just like your quads, your hamstrings, your soleus, and other muscles that you're using. So I would say in terms of like the movement patterns outside of running, a hip hinge is a great place to start, just with body weight, learning to get your hips back, learning to keep your spine in that neutral position, lengthening glutes and hamstrings, and working on that contraction.
This is reminding me of that phrase that I love so much: don't build fitness on top of dysfunction. And it seems like what you're saying is if you don't really understand the movement patterns just yet, if you don't understand how to activate this really important muscle, let's not go and try to do a heavy deadlift or a squat. And this is very similar to me. Like, before you understand your own running mechanics, don't go race a mile as fast as you can, because it's the movement is just not going to be very efficient or economical, and the injury risk is going to be a lot higher. Are there some parallels here between that analogy there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's always quality of movement over quantity. And just as a runner, you want to learn these movement patterns first. And that's where I feel like we always emphasize strength training. That's where strength training comes in handy. But you can be doing certain strength training moves that aren't working on those movement patterns. There's nothing wrong with squats and lunges, but there's other movement patterns that you need to learn. So if you can learn those without lifting, heavy weight first, just getting that quality of movement down, being able to control your body through that movement, rep after rep, and then being able to add resistance to it, you're going to be a much stronger runner with a much better running form and much more efficient of a running form, versus if you can't get those movement patterns down. Those are typically the runners that we see in rehab pretty much each year, because they don't have those movement patterns down that you need to learn before you add any sort of resistance. And that, I think, that displays directly.
Yeah, for sure. This is like, it's so important to be an athlete, not just a runner. And the way I think about that is the quality of your movement, how athletic you are, what your coordination and proprioception is like, and just moving well like an athlete. Because if you think about it, you certainly have to move well if you want to run very far or if you want to run very fast. So anyone who's running half marathons or marathons or anyone with a time goal. You know, I call these performance-oriented runners. These are runners who care about their performance. And if you are that kind of a runner, like we've got to treat this almost like this is not a conversation about glutes. This is a global conversation about being a strong, athletic runner who knows how to move well for a variety of different exercises. And I think that is just going to better prepare you for the demands of running, which can be quite high.
Yeah, exactly. And that reminds me of just not strength training in that frontal plane position. You know, we're athletes at the end of the day, even if we're not the elite of the elite athletes, you know, competing, we're still all runners are athletes. So we need to be training more out of that frontal plane position. I mean, frontal plane's fine, but what about transverse and sagittal plane where we're able to control our body through these different movement patterns versus just staying in that
Can you
frontal
give
plane
us a
position?
quick definition of the three planes of motion so that we have an idea of how we can move when we get in the gym to better help us as runners?
Yep. Frontal plane, think of like squats, lunges, I guess even deadlifts, anything straight on. Sagittal plane, I want you to think of anything lateral. Transverse plane, I want you to think of anything rotating.
I think
just to keep it
back to
pretty
my
simple.
basketball days, and I'm like, wow, I moved so much better then than I do now because I was turning and jumping and playing defense side to side, and now I'm running straight ahead, and I can tell that my body is just less robust than when I was, you know, a little bit more of an athletic basketball player.
Yeah, and just having like that different variety of movement and your body being able to respond to it.
Yeah,
I
for
feel like
sure.
that goes a long way.
Finally, Lisa, let's talk a little bit more about the time where you're not training. So you're not warming up from a run, you're not stopping a run to do some activation work to keep those muscles fired up and engaged, and you're not strength training after a run. You're working, you're hanging out with your family, you're having some social time, you're doing chores. Are there any bad habits that contribute to this problem, or are there easy things that we can do to sort of keep these glutes happy and healthy for the other 22, 23 hours of the day?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know, you know, a lot of people work from home or they have a seated desk job. And while sitting isn't necessarily going to make your glutes weaker, as long as you're strength training outside of it, you don't want to be in a position for a long period of time. You know, your what do they say? Your best posture is your next posture. So if you can stay in a different position, you know, standing, walking around, maybe taking a quick, you know, 5-minute stretch break, I think that's going to go a long way. You just really don't want to be in one position for a long period of time. They're now even calling it the sitting disease, which is like apparently worse than smoking, which I believe, but you just don't want to be in that, you know, seated position where you're just in the rounded shoulders, the head's forward. You know, you want to make sure that you're always, I know it's not possible for everyone, but maybe every hour changing positions, standing, sitting.
Yeah, you know, I
thing.
think this phenomenon can really be like viscerally understood. If you go do a long run or you do a faster workout, you come home and you hunch over your phone in a chair for an hour without doing any sort of cool down or anything like that, you're going to feel 30 years older when you get out of that chair. Your whole body is going to be tight, and you're going to feel the opposite of loose, athletic, supple, and on and on. So I think this idea of just a regular movement practice is really valuable because, you know, it's not like we have to think about being an athlete all 24 hours of the day. We should just try not to be super sedentary because that's not really how our bodies are designed. So this really resonates with me. I think it's just very practical, but also easy advice for most runners to follow. You know, just get up once an hour, you know, take a walk, you know, take the stairs once or twice a day instead of the elevator so that you can just get different ranges of motion and things like that. So I think these are helpful, you know, I think some coaches call them movement snacks, you know, just throughout the day, you're snacking on different movements. And that really goes a long way at keeping you healthy and just generally athletic. And I think that's super valuable.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's the same when you're strength training. You don't want to just stay in that frontal plane position. And it's the same when you're working too. You want to rotate, even if it's just a couple times throughout the day. You want to move in these different movement patterns, which is obviously going to be a little bit more challenging when you're, head in working and trying to stay focused. But if you can just do a couple different movements, such as twisting your spine, loosening up your thoracic spine, and just even standing or walking around for a couple minutes, I think that's going to
For
go a
sure.
long way.
Well, Lisa, I'm encouraged that this problem isn't a death sentence for runners. I'm encouraged that we can take some pretty easy interventions here to really make sure that we're prioritizing what I think are some of the most important muscle groups for runners, the glute complex, just because it's so big and it's so important for not just our performance, but keeping us healthy long term. And I definitely want to do a longer form conversation where I don't feel so rushed on Instagram Live here on the Strength Grind podcast, which I think is going to be really fun. So anyone watching who enjoyed this, we're going to go much deeper on the podcast soon. And Lisa, I'll be in touch with that. Do you have any resources that might be helpful for folks who are tuning in right now? Workouts, even just ideas to think more strategically about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I have on my YouTube channel, I know I have 5 glute exercises every runner needs to do, and a lot of them are more of that activation or like building the movement patterns that runners need. I think that would be a great resource just to start with, just so you're not completely overwhelmed. But I think going into a deeper conversation is going to be really beneficial, because while the glutes are super important, they're also very misunderstood by a lot of runners. So I think that's going to be very beneficial for runners to just understand how to use your glutes, why we should even be using our glutes, and how to really take your running to the next level by strengthening and then working on the power of your glutes.
Yes,
So
you are speaking my language. This is exciting. So yeah, I can't wait to do that podcast with you. That should be live in a couple of weeks. I'll be in touch to schedule it, Lisa, and we can really go down the rabbit hole on this topic. But thanks. This was super helpful, and it was really great to connect for the first time.
Yeah. Same with you, Jason. Thank you so much, and we'll continue this on your podcast.
Talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.